It is one of history's cruelest paradoxes. The United States won the war, yet some of its soldiers kept fighting long after the final surrender. Imagine being trapped on a Pacific island, surrounded by silence, cut off from the world, convinced that your nation still needed you, even though the war had ended months, even years ago. For most Americans, World War II concluded on September 2, 1945, with a signature on the deck of the USS Missouri. But for a handful of forgotten men, it never ended. Their war continued in the steaming jungles of islands like Guam, Peleliu, and Mindanao, where orders had frozen in time. They became living ghosts, the last fragments of a machine that refused to stop turning. The story of these soldiers, both American and Japanese, is often told as tragedy, but underneath lies something more unsettling. What if the refusal to surrender was not madness, but a reflection of something deeply American, the belief that giving up is worse than death? That myth of eternal resistance echoes through modern life, in business, in politics, in the relentless grind culture that tells you to keep pushing no matter the cost. The same stubborn spirit that helped win the war also created generations terrified of standing still. The Pacific didn't just produce battles, it produced the American obsession with victory at all costs. To understand that, you must picture an island not as a paradise postcard, but as a fever dream of endurance. The air hums with mosquitoes. The nights are thick with the smell of rot and gun oil. Soldiers sleep in mud, dream of home, and wake to the same green hell. Supplies never arrive, radios die, and letters dissolve in the rain. The jungle becomes their entire universe, a pulsing, living creature that devours reason. On such islands, time itself erodes. Days blur. Reality drifts. By 1945, when the world celebrated peace, small units still fired at phantoms, convinced the enemy was just beyond the trees. And perhaps, in a symbolic sense, he was. On Guam, there were reports of men still fighting 3 years after the war. Some hid in caves, emerging at night to steal food from local villagers. They whispered to one another that the newspapers were lies, that the surrender was propaganda. The irony is brutal. They mistrusted peace because they had lived too long inside war's logic. The same pattern appeared among American holdouts in the Philippines and even in remote parts of the Aleutians. Soldiers lost, cut off, or mentally trapped in combat routines that no longer existed. Their uniforms rotted away, their dog tags turned to rust, but their conviction stayed stainless. Orders were sacred. To surrender was treason. Victory was oxygen, and so they breathed it long after the air had gone stale. When historians later interviewed these survivors, what struck them wasn't fanaticism, but faith, a kind of religious devotion to purpose. One Marine said, "If we stopped fighting, it would mean none of it mattered." That sentence could be engraved on the American psyche itself. It's the same sentiment that fuels billion-dollar self-help industries and tech CEOs who boast about sleeping 4 hours a night. The battlefield simply moved from coral beaches to glass towers, but the script stayed the same. Never surrender, never slow down, never question the mission. In a way, the forgotten soldiers were the purest embodiment of that creed. Human beings who literally could not stop fighting, even when there was nothing left to win. There's a strange beauty to their delusion. Imagine believing so fiercely in duty that even truth cannot break you. It's both heroic and horrifying. And perhaps that's why America rarely talks about its own holdouts. The myth of the unbroken fighter is easier to celebrate when he wins. But what happens when he keeps fighting after the war is over? When courage turns into denial and faith becomes madness? These are questions that echo beyond battlefields. They whisper in boardrooms, in social media feeds, in the sleepless minds of millions who fear being seen as weak. The ghosts of the Pacific didn't die in the jungle. They simply changed uniforms. A single image ties all of this together. The rusted helmet half buried in sand. It's both relic and mirror, reflecting how the human spirit corrodes when trapped in its own glory. The helmet once protected, then imprisoned. It carried honor, then weight. Likewise, the same ideals that built a nation can also chain it to perpetual struggle. Every generation inherits that helmet, the belief that peace is just another form of surrender. And so the cycle continues, from Okinawa to Wall Street, from foxholes to cubicles, from radio static to the endless scroll of modern life. In that sense, the last battle of the Pacific never truly ended. It just shifted form. The question is no longer who will surrender, but whether we even know what victory means anymore. When success becomes survival and rest becomes defeat, maybe the real enemy isn't across the ocean, but inside the mind that refuses to stop marching. Somewhere, deep in that forgotten island of memory, the war still hums, low, steady, unrelenting, reminding us that sometimes the hardest thing to do is simply to lay down your arms. And in that haunting quiet, among the ruins of conviction, something begins to move again. The faint rustle of another story waiting to be told, about those who stayed behind, unseen, and became legends of loyalty and loss. In the early morning haze, the island breathes like a sleeping animal. Mist curls through the palms, birds shriek unseen, and somewhere in the undergrowth, the faint click of a rifle echoes, not as an act of war, but as a heartbeat. For the men who refused to surrender, life after 1945 wasn't peace. It was a long, slow hallucination of duty. They became phantoms of their own country, shadows patrolling an empire that no longer existed. Their enemies were gone, their commanders dead, their maps dissolved. Yet the war went on inside their heads. History calls them holdouts, but in truth, they were ghosts long before they died. One of the strangest cases emerged from the dense jungles of Guam. In 1972, Japanese Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi was discovered living in a bamboo burrow, believing the war had never ended. American soldiers, too, were reported missing for years. Pilots shot down over the Pacific, reconnaissance teams swallowed by jungle, radio operators trapped on small atolls. Some were presumed dead, others simply forgotten in the bureaucratic fog of victory. Yet for those who survived, their existence turned into a living experiment in isolation. The jungle replaced the chain of command. Hunger became their general. Silence their only ally. The American holdouts were a different kind of ghost, born not from denial, but from abandonment. They weren't clinging to orders, they were clinging to meaning. Many of them, when rescued, described the jungle as alive, not in a poetic way, but in a spiritual one. They believed it tested them, punished weakness, demanded faith. When they finally met rescuers, they didn't celebrate, they trembled, unsure if these strangers were real. The mind, after years of vigilance, doesn't accept peace easily. It needs an enemy to define itself. Without one, it invents a substitute. Psychologists who studied these soldiers later noted a strange pattern. They often smiled when recounting their hardships. The smile wasn't joy, it was survival. To admit suffering was to admit defeat. That instinct, to armor pain in pride, runs deep in American culture. The same smile appears in veterans refusing therapy, in workers boasting about burnout, in citizens who mistake exhaustion for patriotism. On the islands, that smile became a mask against madness. They built routines from chaos, cleaning rusted weapons, measuring days by the sound of waves, carving calendars into coconut shells. Time itself became a ritual, a substitute for hope. The Pacific, in those years, was an open graveyard of lost intentions. Even after the war, the ocean kept coughing up relics. Helmets, bones, letters sealed in waterproof tins. Each object was a whisper from men who had once believed history needed them. Some of those whispers reached American families back home, decades late, like messages in bottles drifting across generations. Imagine opening a letter from your father that says, "We're still holding the line," and realizing that line dissolved before you were born. That's not just tragedy, it's theology, the worship of endurance beyond logic. There's an American sermon hidden inside those jungles. It says, "Keep going." It doesn't matter if the cause has faded or the enemy has vanished. Just keep moving, keep fighting, keep proving you exist. It's the same gospel preached by Silicon Valley motivational posters, military recruitment ads, and gym walls. Somewhere between bravery and delusion, that message turns sacred. The ghost soldiers of the Pacific were its first disciples, men who mistook persistence for salvation. They didn't need a flag anymore. The act of surviving became the flag itself. Eyewitnesses who stumbled upon them describe scenes both tragic and serene. A soldier standing knee-deep in a river, whispering orders to no one. Another building a fire every night in the same spot, convinced his squad would return. Some even made small shrines of driftwood and spent shells, praying for victory long achieved. To outsiders, it looked insane, but to them, surrender would have been spiritual suicide. They weren't fighting the enemy, they were fighting erasure. As long as they stayed alive, their war still mattered. And maybe, in a strange cosmic sense, they were right. The image that defines this part of the story is the flicker of firelight against the jungle. Each flame a heartbeat, each shadow a reminder of humanity's refusal to disappear quietly. The ghosts of the Pacific burned quietly for decades, unburied, unseen, unthanked. Their loyalty became both curse and compass, guiding them nowhere, but keeping them alive. And in that irony lies the essence of human contradiction. We need purpose so desperately that we'll invent it when it's gone. When rescuers finally convinced the last of them to return, the world had moved on to new wars, new fears, new screens. America had traded rifles for television antennas, telegrams for televised heroism. Yet the returning ghosts didn't belong anywhere. They were symbols of a question the nation preferred not to ask. What happens when the fight becomes your identity? When you no longer know who you are without an enemy? That question lingers like smoke. And as the jungle's fires died out, another kind of battle began. One not fought with bullets, but with memory, pride, and the unending ache of men who survived their own legend. Somewhere in the heart of that silence, a single rifle leans against a tree, untouched, its barrel pointed toward the sky, a monument to belief itself, and to the ghosts who refused to fade, even when history tried to forget them. Honor. It's a word carved into the American myth like the stripes on the flag. But on the Pacific Islands, that word turned into a hallucination. For the soldiers stranded after the war, honor wasn't a medal or a speech. It was the last thread tying them to sanity. When you've been trained to believe that surrender equals shame, survival itself becomes treason. And so they clung to honor, the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, even as it dragged them deeper into the abyss. Some historians would later call it collective madness. But madness is just logic taken to its final, merciless conclusion. Both the American and Japanese holdouts were victims of the same invisible empire, an empire built on myths of glory, sacrifice, and national righteousness. For Japan, the Bushido Code turned every defeat into a test of purity. For America, victory had to mean moral superiority. The problem is, when you're trapped in that ideology, there's no room for ambiguity. If honor means never yielding, then peace becomes suspicious, compassion becomes weakness, and truth itself becomes negotiable. The Pacific wasn't just a battlefield of nations. It was a laboratory where ideology infected biology, rewiring human instinct into something mechanical. Picture one of those soldiers, bones thin as bamboo, eyes sunken from years of malnutrition, still polishing his rifle every morning like a sacred ritual. That gun isn't a weapon anymore. It's a totem. It's how he prays, how he remembers who he is. He whispers the names of his fallen comrades, though no one can hear him. Each syllable is both confession and curse. In that moment, honor transforms into obsession. The jungle, once an enemy, becomes a confessional booth. The endless rain baptizes him daily in futility. Yet he cannot stop, because to stop is to admit he was wrong. And in war, being wrong is worse than dying. Modern psychologists might call it cognitive dissonance, but that phrase feels too sterile. This was something closer to faith, a sacred refusal to abandon meaning, even when meaning has betrayed you. And here's the twist that makes the story uncomfortably familiar. That same faith still thrives in modern America. Every motivational speech about never quitting, every slogan about winning the fight, echoes those jungle prayers. We have traded helmets for headsets, rifles for resumes, but the command remains identical. Don't surrender. The battlefield has shifted from coral reefs to office desks, yet the soldiers march on, invisible but obedient. One former Marine, decades later, confessed in an interview, "I didn't know how to live without an enemy." That sentence could serve as a diagnosis for an entire civilization addicted to struggle. The Cold War, the war on terror, the war against aging, the war against mediocrity, the American imagination is a perpetual state of combat. We frame even self-improvement as warfare. Our heroes are those who fight forever, not those who know when to stop. And so, like the stranded soldiers, we risk becoming prisoners of our own valor. The Japanese holdouts, too, lived by that creed. Men like Hiro Onada, who emerged from the Philippine jungle in 1974, still wearing his uniform and carrying his rifle. He had ignored every leaflet, every radio broadcast declaring the war's end, convinced they were tricks by the enemy. When his commanding officer, decades older, long retired, was flown in to relieve him of duty, Onoda wept not from relief, but from purpose lost. The moment he saluted and handed over his sword, history caught up with him. He stepped from myth into time, and time, being merciless, erased him. There's a cruel symmetry in that scene. Onoda bowed as an act of honor, while the American officers who received him saluted as an act of respect. Yet both were mourning the same illusion, that honor and truth always align. In reality, they rarely do. Sometimes honor demands blindness. Sometimes it devours empathy. In the jungles of the Pacific, it consumed entire identities, turning good men into relics of loyalty too pure for survival. The image that binds this part of the story is the mirror, cracked, fogged, reflecting fragments of a face that no longer knows itself. The mirror is both battlefield and shrine. It shows what duty looks like when stripped of glory. A man arguing with ghosts, worshiping a code no one else remembers. And yet, we admire him. Because deep down, we envy certainty. We crave a cause so absolute it erases doubt. That's the seduction of duty. It simplifies chaos. It tells you exactly who to be and what to do, even if the world no longer makes sense. In the end, the soldiers who refused to surrender weren't insane. They were faithful to a system that had already vanished. Their madness was loyalty in its purest form, unfiltered, unbreakable, tragically logical. When they finally returned home, they didn't fit anywhere. Their discipline was a foreign language in a culture that had moved on to television and consumerism. They were relics of a moral universe that no longer existed, walking testaments to the danger of confusing endurance with virtue. And so the question lingers, like the taste of rust in the air. What happens when honor outlives purpose? When the code that once saved you becomes the cage that kills you? In that silence between glory and guilt, the Pacific Islands still whisper. The waves crash against forgotten bunkers, and the jungle grows over the bones of men who mistook obedience for salvation. Somewhere beneath a canopy of rustling palms, a broken radio still hissed. It crackled faintly, like an old god whispering nonsense. For the soldiers left behind, that radio was both oracle and tormentor. It had once been their only link to the outside world, a fragile thread between madness and meaning. But as its batteries died and its messages faded into static, the line between truth and illusion dissolved. They began to invent their own broadcasts. Headquarters reports reinforcements are coming. Victory is near. Hold your position. Lies, yes, but lies with purpose. Hope, after all, is just a well-told deception. That radio became the beating heart of delusion. Each burst of static was interpreted as a secret message, each silence as coded approval from command. The irony is devastating. The same device built to connect them to civilization became the instrument that trapped them in isolation. It's a perfect metaphor for the modern condition. We live surrounded by information, drowning in signals, yet more disconnected than ever. The jungle had its radio, we have our phones. Both promise truth and deliver confusion. Both make us mistake noise for meaning. In one account, a rescue plane circled above a remote Philippine island in 1947, dropping leaflets that read, "The war has ended, come home." The soldiers below burned them. To their ears, the message was psychological warfare. If it were true, one survivor later explained, our commanders would tell us directly. But the commanders were long dead, the orders never updated. The sky itself became a liar, raining down false peace. For men who had lived by discipline, the idea that truth could arrive from the clouds felt blasphemous, and so they shot at the sky. Years later, when anthropologists and military historians studied those holdouts, they discovered something chillingly familiar. Every soldier, regardless of nationality, had created a mythology of waiting. The jungle wasn't prison, it was prophecy. They believed salvation would come if they held faith a little longer. When it didn't, they invented signs. Bird calls mistaken for Morse code, cloud shapes resembling command insignia, lightning as divine affirmation. The human mind, deprived of connection, becomes a church of its own lies. America's post-war years weren't so different. While these forgotten soldiers waited for rescue, the nation that sent them was entering its own hall of mirrors. The Cold War was beginning. A new era of invisible enemies, propaganda, and moral certainty. Radios back home hummed too, broadcasting speeches about freedom, victory, and vigilance. The sound was the same static, only louder. Citizens were told to keep watch, to never trust silence, to build bomb shelters, and believe in the righteousness of perpetual defense. In a way, the entire country became one enormous island, convinced the fight was never over. There's something darkly poetic about that parallel. Those soldiers with their rusted radios were merely the microcosm of a much larger truth. That empires survive by keeping their people afraid of peace. A nation that cannot rest must always find a new enemy, even if that enemy is invisible. The Pacific ghosts waited for orders that never came. Modern America waits for closure that never will. The noise keeps us awake. The silence terrifies us. One American pilot who crashed near Palau recalled, before being rescued, that the jungle sounded alive, like 1,000 voices whispering the same word, stay. That word became mantra and curse. Stay. Don't leave. Don't change. Endurance became worship. Even when he was rescued, he confessed feeling guilty, as if betraying some cosmic promise by surviving. That's the emotional aftershock of endless war. You start mistaking survival for sin. The image that carries this part of the story is the sky itself. During the day, it glared white and indifferent. At night, it glittered with cruel serenity, as if heaven were mocking them. They built fires to send smoke signals, but no one came. Each dawn, they scanned the horizon for ships that never appeared. In that emptiness, they began to believe the war had become eternal. Not a conflict of nations, but a test of the soul. To surrender would mean collapsing the world's last remaining purpose. Decades later, when the last known holdout was brought back to civilization, journalists asked him what kept him going. He said the radio promised they were coming. When told the broadcasts were static, he simply nodded. Then it was a good lie. That sentence, simple, haunting, captures the essence of faith in all its forms. Humanity doesn't survive on truth alone. It survives on conviction, even false ones. Sometimes the lie is kinder than the silence. And yet, that silence still hangs over us. Today, the static has changed shape. It's digital now, algorithmic, relentless, addictive. We scroll through endless signals, waiting for a message that will make the noise stop. We tell ourselves rescue is coming, in the form of success, validation, escape. But the jungle never really lets us go. Somewhere inside every glowing screen, the same voice whispers, "Hold your position." So the question remains, not for the lost soldiers, but for us. When the sky itself starts lying, how do you know when the war is truly over? Perhaps the answer isn't in listening for the next transmission, but in learning how to live without one. And as the last fires fade and the radios fall silent, what emerges is not peace, but the possibility of hearing, finally, mercifully, our own thoughts again. When the last soldiers stepped out of the jungle, history applauded. But the silence that followed was louder than any cheer. He had survived the impossible, yet he looked more ghost than man, blinking against the glare of a world that no longer needed him. Cameras flashed, politicians smiled, and somewhere, far away, the Pacific sighed, as if the ocean itself was tired of holding secrets. The war was over, they said. But wars don't end. They just change their scenery. The ghosts followed him home. In America, the story of the holdouts became a curiosity, a strange relic of human stubbornness. Newsreels called them the last soldiers, as if they were fossils dug from time itself. But beneath the fascination was discomfort. These men had done what the culture claimed to admire: loyalty, endurance, faith in mission. And yet their devotion now looked tragic, even absurd. They were mirrors that reflected the parts of America it preferred not to see. The obsession with winning, the fear of standing still, the inability to stop fighting even when there's nothing left to prove. The island had been their battlefield, but America was its echo chamber. Historians often treat these stories as footnotes, but they are actually prophecies. The modern world, with its endless cycles of competition and distraction, has turned everyone into a kind of holdout. We defend ideas long proven wrong. We wage wars online against invisible enemies. We refuse to surrender habits that exhaust us because we've been told quitting is failure. The jungle just changed shape. It's digital now, humming with Wi-Fi instead of mosquitoes. And the radio that once lied about reinforcements? It's in our pockets, whispering through notifications that never stop coming. The difference is that now no one tells us to stand down. We are all self-appointed soldiers of relevance, fighting for validation, attention, identity. Every scroll, every argument, every late-night thought is another battle to stay seen. The same madness that kept men crouched in the Pacific mud now keeps millions awake at 2 a.m., staring into the blue glow of a screen. We call it productivity, ambition, hustle, but beneath those shiny words lies the same ancient fear. If we stop, we disappear. And yet, there's a strange beauty in that persistence. Humanity endures not because it knows peace, but because it keeps searching for it, even when it forgets what it looks like. The holdouts of the Pacific weren't cowards or fools. They were the last believers in a world that demanded certainty. They remind us that conviction, even misplaced, can be both our salvation and our curse. The line between hero and relic is drawn only by time, and time is merciless. What seems noble today may look insane tomorrow. The image that carries this ending is the ocean, vast, indifferent, infinite. It swallows every island, every name, every battle. Yet beneath the waves lie fragments of helmets, rusted rifles, and dog tags. Proof that belief leaves a residue even after the cause is gone. Those relics don't mourn or accuse. They simply exist, silent testimonies to the human need to matter. If you listen closely, you can still hear the faint echo of boots in the surf, marching nowhere, refusing to fade. Perhaps that's what it means to be American, to live suspended between triumph and unrest, forever haunted by the next mission, the next horizon. The refusal to surrender has built cities, landed rockets, and cured diseases. It has also burned forests, shattered minds, and left generations chasing ghosts. Maybe the lesson of those forgotten soldiers isn't about endurance, but release. Maybe true courage isn't fighting forever, but knowing when to stop. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the sea turns the color of old blood and memory. Somewhere out there, in the quiet between waves, the past hums, not as a warning, but a song. It tells us that victory is never the end, only a pause in the noise. It asks whether we too are ready to come home, to lay down our invisible rifles and listen to the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. If this story has reached you, if, for a moment, you felt the salt air, heard the static, or recognized a piece of yourself in those ghosts, then you already know the war isn't over. It just moved inside us. The next battle will not be fought on an island, but within the restless heart of a civilization that cannot sleep. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the truest victory still waits. Not in conquest, but in understanding. So before you go, remember them. The soldiers who fought too long, the believers who couldn't stop believing. Their story isn't history, it's prophecy. And if you want to keep uncovering the echoes that shaped the world we live in, subscribe, stay curious, and never forget to ask the question that haunted them most. What if the war never ended? It just changed its name.